Today, I'm posting up a second episode for the week. Many years ago, there was an early version of the story presented on our podcast, but over the last month, I've sat down to update and expand it, adding in more information and detail. It's now entirely re-recorded and edited, the story of Walt Disney, Winsor McCay, and the origins of American animation. In 1955, Walt Disney stepped onto a soundstage where a camera crew and a single camera waited for him. It was his second year hosting a weekly television series then called Disneyland. Just like the amusement park he had recently opened in Anaheim, the theme of his Disneyland TV show rotated between the different lands in his amusement park. One week the show might be tied to science fiction elements of Tomorrowland, another week the western adventures of Frontierland. This week, though, the show was tied to the animated wonders of Fantasyland, specifically a show about the history of animation. It was a topic that Walt himself had explored for years. In 1955, Walt was still thin, dressed in a white shirt, black tie, and gray jacket which hung loosely from his shoulders in a straight line to his hips. Around him was a recreation of his office, or at least the type of office that the public thought Walt Disney might occupy, with a desk, a tall bookcase, and a small print of Mickey Mouse and also one of Bambi up on the wall. In reality, his working office was different than the one that appeared on screen. Located at the top of the animation building, his real office held bookcases, but also easy chairs, couches, high display shelves filled with curiosities and miniatures, and a baby grand piano, so composers could demonstrate songs written for his pictures. In all likelihood, a faithful recreation of his actual office would have appeared too visually cluttered to film well for TV. So one of his designers created this stage office, from which he introduced his TV show. An office with open wall spaces, books with matching spines to create visual unity, and clean table surfaces. Still, in the mind of most Americans, this stage office was Walt's office. A clean space devoid of clutter, one perfectly appointed to appear in an interior design magazine. For a while now, this week's episode had been scripted, an hour-long documentary on the history of animation called The Story of the Animated Drawing. For the past year, Walt had used his weekly TV show to explain how his own films had been made, from special effects in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea to the equipment used to create his true-life adventure nature documentaries. His explorations focused on the artistry necessary to create Disney films and the engineering marvels that allowed these films to become a reality. But today, Walt would do something different, at least in the first half of this show. He would reach beyond the history of the Disney company to explain how artists, long before Walt made his own first cartoon, invented animation. For Walt, this was a personal project, a documentary that occupied him more than other episodes of the TV show. Walt introduced the show and narrated all of it. Disney director Wilfred Jackson explained he didn't often do that. Walt's script was arranged to highlight two groups of people who were essential to the creation and evolution of animation. The first group was, of course, the artists, though by 1955, most working animators had been classically trained in art school. Many early American animators were self-trained artists, typically working as illustrators for newspapers or magazines. The second group, mostly invisible to the public, was a set of engineers, machinists, and chemists who created the machinery and processes that allowed for animation to exist. By this point, during that day on which Walt stood on the soundstage, all of these historical elements had been arranged into a script. The first segment of the show was focused on early animation that existed before motion picture equipment, with a focus on inventions that allowed drawings to move. Walt presented a phenakistoscope, zoetrope, a spinning wheel that, when used with a mirror, allowed a single viewer to see a drawing move, such as a set of sequential drawings of a man walking down a street. Walt also demonstrated the zoetrope, more commonly called the wheel of light. This was a spinning drum that, as it turned, allowed a viewer to see a dozen sequential drawings mysteriously come to life. One significant limitation of these early devices is that only one person at a time could view the animation. The second segment of the show focused on early hand-drawn animation that was filmed with a camera and then projected onto a screen. These early animations typically didn't appear in cinemas, at least not at first, but on the vaudeville stage. Often, an animator would stand before an audience and introduce his or her work before it appeared on screen. Only later, as theaters were arranged to present live-action films, did animation fully migrate over to cinemas. On his show, Walt introduced a number of early animators. He discussed Stuart Blackton, who created animation with chalk drawings on a blackboard, changing and erasing part of the drawing between each frame. He discussed John Randolph Bray, who organized an early animation studio as a business rather than as a side hobby, which was how many early newspaper illustrators first approached the form. But on the Disney program, more importantly than any of these other figures, was Winsor McCay, a brilliant illustrator who in the early 1900s pinned comics featured in Hearst newspapers across the country. Starting in 1911, McCay created animated shorts in addition to his work at the Hearst newspapers, moving drawings that were initially presented by him as part of a vaudeville act. His first effort was a filmic presentation of his newspaper comic, Little Nemo in Slumberland, the story of a boy's fantastic adventures in the land of dreams and nightmares. At only 2 minutes in length, for audiences, the wonder of this first film was simply watching newspaper comics move across the screen. To create color, McCay used a pen to ink finished frames of the film with light touches of color. Little Nemo's clothes became yellow and red, and the dragon who appeared in the final scene became green. McCay toured with this film, presenting it in vaudeville venues as an audience would not only see the film, but also meet the man who drew one of the most famous cartoon strips in the country. His second effort, more inventive than the first, focused on an overgrown mosquito who pesters a man trying to sleep. But it was his third film, an American masterpiece of animation called Gertie the Dinosaur, that inspired dozens and dozens of artists to pursue careers in animation. The stage act was relatively straightforward. Winsor McCay stood on a vaudeville stage next to a screen and talked with his creation. It was a carefully choreographed act in which the hand-drawn face of Gertie the Dinosaur seemed to comprehend what McCay was saying. McCay gave Gertie commands, which she reluctantly followed. This back and forth, of course, was planned out months earlier as McCay and his assistant made the film. But the finished version looked extremely effective on stage. Ward Kimball, one key animator of Disney's golden age, would later explain, "The funny thing is, when you look at Winsor McCay's animation, it's so startlingly real." Beyond Kimball, a long line of other early Disney animators pointed to Gertie as a key film that inspired them to become animators. Artists such as Walt's early partner Ub Iwerks, the lead Disney animator of the 1930s, Bill Teitla, and Dick Huemer, who, before arriving at Disney, worked at many early animation studios and deeply understood the range of American offerings in this field. In the TV documentary, the Disney team not only showed excerpts of McCay's animation, they recreated the entire vaudeville presentation. "I reconstructed the circumstances under which Winsor McCay did Gertie the Dinosaur," Dick Huemer explained. "The Disney team, reproduced it exactly from my descriptions, and even hired an actor who looked like McCay. That is, in the mid-1950s, Dick Huemer relied on his memories of seeing McCay perform his show in 1914, which became the basis for what Walt Disney included in his television episode. Winsor McCay's creation of the character Gertie became a touchstone of early American animation, a drawn character whose facial expressions and bodily gestures conveyed continuous emotion and thought. Gertie wasn't just a moving drawing, she was a moving drawing whose presence conveyed a far deeper sense of believable life than had previously been achieved in animation. The inspiration of Gertie would stay with the Disney Company long after. Walt created his hour-long documentary about the pioneers of animation in 1955. Gertie would be included in dozens, if not hundreds of books on the origins of animation. Gertie would be shown in retrospectives of American animation, but perhaps most uniquely, in 1989, when the Disney Company built its third theme park in Florida, then called the Disney MGM Studios, in its central lagoon, they created a full-size replica of Gertie rising up out of the water. Standing at over 20 feet in height and now painted green, Gertie, in a sense, welcomed guests to the Disney park, standing at the edge of Echo Lake, an homage to the early origins of the American art form. But back in 1955, as Walt stepped onto the soundstage dressed in a dark suit and tie, he stood before the camera ready to introduce a new audience to the wonders of early animation, a topic that, at that time, hadn't yet been explored in classrooms and was only beginning to be explored in books. Standing beneath the lights, Walt focused in on filming, shot after shot. The day went quickly, as this was material that he had explored for most of his life. "We shot Walt's live action on one day," Wilfred Jackson explained, and he recorded the narration at another later date. At the center of this documentary was a recreation of Winsor McCay's famous vaudeville act. The show also included a few clips of Gertie the Dinosaur, a film that at that point was so long out of circulation that the Disney Company had to borrow a print from McCay's son, Robert. The goal, as the Disney team understood it, was to use Walt's popularity and influence to help establish early animation as a topic of historical study and to honor all of the early inventors and artists that paved the way for later animated spectaculars. By the time that historians and scholars were interested in the development of early animation, Winsor McCay had passed away, having died of an embolism in 1934. But his young assistant and neighbor, John Fitzsimmons, survived him by many decades and gave a set of interviews about how McCay created his films. Today, we're going to explore the story of how that early influential cartoon, Gertie the Dinosaur, was made. The cartoon that inspired a generation of early animators. That is, at least right now, we aren't going to focus on the artist at Disney or even at Warner Brothers, but we are going to explore this short piece of animation, one that was forever flickering away inside the heads of many Disney artists, fond memories that were first placed there during their childhoods. This film would be the one that eventually inspired them to make such features as Snow White and Pinocchio. When John Fitzsimmons was in elementary school, his family moved to Sheepshead Bay, just south of New York City. Sheepshead Bay was a resort community, a beach town not far from Coney Island, also a horse racing destination, with 3 of the nation's largest tracks in its vicinity. Fitzsimmons' father, nicknamed Sonny Jim, a former jockey and a well-liked thoroughbred trainer, had moved there specifically to work at the local tracks, but John Fitzsimmons wasn't much interested in horses. He was interested in art and was surprised to learn that in the early 1900s, one of America's best-known comic strip artists had also just moved to town. In school, Fitzsimmons met Winsor McCay's son, Bob. Even more surprising, Bob wasn't much interested in art. He was interested in horses. At the time, he wanted to be a horseman. He had his own horse and also a beautifully ornamented Western saddle given to him by Buffalo Bill. The two boys, quick friends, worked out an exchange. John Fitzsimmons would introduce Bob to his father, the horse trainer, and Bob would introduce Fitzsimmons to Winsor McCay, the artist. When Bob and I entered the McCay house, Fitzsimmons explained, we found his father occupied with penciling in an idea for a new Little Nemo episode on an oversized sheet of smooth Bristol board spread out on a drawing board. After the social amenities ended, the artist graciously invited me to sit by his side while he resumed work. In a matter of minutes, I got the feeling that due to his deep concentration, my presence had been completely dismissed from his mind. The realization that I was not distracting my host added to my comfort, while at the same time affording me the opportunity I had wished for, the privilege all art students appreciate, watching a master artist at work. I was astonished to notice that his working tools consisted only of a bottle of Higgins black drawing ink, a few Galot number 290 pins and holders, a large lump of art gum, a T-square and angle, plus an assortment of sharpened Venus lead pencils, and of course, his always conspicuous ashtray. No inspirational copy was required for detail. McCay had only to call upon his remarkable memory to produce his fantastic drawings. I never ceased to be amazed at how little preliminary outlining work McCay needed to do before starting directly on the finished stage of inking in, and even on the elaborate technical drawings for which he was so justly famous. After that first meeting, for a while, Fitzsimmons and Winsor McCay became friends. McCay, the old master, and Fitzsimmons, the boy with an interest in art. Sometime before the end of 8th grade, Fitzsimmons decided to leave public schools, choosing instead to go to work and attend classes at the Art Students League in New York City. For a while, to earn money, he helped his father down at the track. The work with horses expanded over the summer as he traveled with his father through the U.S. and Canada from track to track. But his focus remained on art and on McCay. McCay preferred working to any other manner of occupying his time, Fitzsimmons said. In addition, he was definitely a night person who could function just as effectively and tirelessly under the artificial illumination during the still wee hours of the night as he could under daylight conditions. In fact, I believe he preferred the quiet of the night to the distractions of the day. If there was one meal that Mr. Mac enjoyed more than any other, it was a relaxing, leisurely breakfast. It was not unusual at such meals for him to spend an hour or so slowly consuming what had been served while perusing every item of interest in his morning paper or conversing with a breakfast guest, as it was so often my good fortune to be. It was during these informal breakfast confabs that I was to gain a rather intimate insight into McCay's thoughts and attitudes. Fitzsimmons learned that McCay didn't simply work as a cartoonist for extra money and perhaps to see people enjoy his work in person. McCay also worked as a vaudeville performer whenever his schedule with the newspaper would allow. On stage, he drew characters from his comic strip Little Nemo. He produced quick drawings that, like a magic act, depicted characters who aged as the audience watched. Fitzsimmons learned about McCay's views on politics and religion. He was even there as McCay started to develop an interest in animation. I had arrived for a visit with the artist in his Voorhees Avenue home one Sunday morning just after his papers had been delivered. Fitzsimmons said. His chief interest, naturally, at the moment, was to see how well the full-page reproduction of his Little Nemo work on page 1 had turned out. In withdrawing the comic section from the body of the paper, its supplement of animated cutouts fell from between the folds. These cutouts were the elements of a flipbook, or what McCay casually called a flipper pad, that when assembled by kids would show a drawing fluttering into motion. McCay looked at the cutouts, then passed them to Fitzsimmons and explained that to the best of his knowledge, these new flipbooks, often called moving comics, functioned much like live-action film, with an image shifting a little in each new drawing. As Fitzsimmons soon learned, these cutouts were part of a new series produced by one of the Hearst papers, the New York American, a set of 12 or 20 images that, when placed in sequence each Sunday, showed a drawing fluttering into motion. Not long after that, McCay started to consider ways that he might make a longer flipbook, something that might last for a minute or two, perhaps be part of his vaudeville performance, newspaper comics that moved when projected on a screen. The way Mr. Mack explained his advent into the movie business was this, Fitzsimmons said. George McManus and 2 other artist friends had gathered for a drink in the newspaperman's favorite bar, not far from the Journal American office building. During their conversation, someone brought up the subject of the animated cartoon supplement currently running in the Sunday American. Jokingly, of course, McManus suggested that McCay make several thousand animated drawings, photograph them onto film, and show the result in theaters. For a few moments, it seemed as though McManus meant to be serious. Then he explained some of the difficulties of such an undertaking. Thousands and thousands of drawings, the monumental photographic task of putting the drawings on film, together with the enormous amount of time it would take to simply make a picture of 5 minutes duration, placed such a project in the realm of dreams. Utterly impossible, and so it was considered by all except McCay. The artist agreed that such a venture was no doubt gigantic, but not impossible. On a dare, McCay claimed that he would produce enough line drawings to sustain a 4 or 5 minute animated cartoon and would use the film as a special feature of his already popular vaudeville act. I was told that McManus considered the proposal so ridiculous that he actually bet Mr. Mack he would never finish the 5,000 drawings needed. The result of this story, presumably, was the 2-minute film of the Little Nemo characters. It was soon followed by a second comic film, 6 minutes in length, this time called How a Mosquito Operates. Fitzsimmons himself was not involved with either cartoon. As a 16-year-old, he spent his days at art school and helped his father at the track. But when he was 17, or perhaps 18, still in art school, he found a job at a newspaper building, the same one where McCay worked, the Hearst building, out of which came both a morning paper, the American, and an evening paper, the Journal. McCay was a cartoonist and Fitzsimmons was an office boy, both working in the art department. I used to be with him several times a week, Fitzsimmons said, when he was doing his newspaper work. We had a lot of good conversations. During these months, Fitzsimmons was the only one allowed to walk in and watch McCay draw, as he had sense enough not to disturb the great artist when he was deep in thought. Sometimes Fitzsimmons would sit there for 20, maybe 30 minutes quietly watching. He used to like to talk to me, Fitzsimmons said. McCay told him about his family, his ideas on life, and also humorous stories that had happened to him. With this, their friendship deepened. McCay invited him over to his house as his friend, not as his son's friend, and that led to the origin of their professional relationship. The idea for the Gertie film, at least according to Winsor McCay, occurred at the Natural History Museum in New York City, while he and a friend were observing the immense skeletons of extinct creatures. McCay's friend, adopting a tone of good humor, turned to him and said, Wouldn't a man with a trained dinosaurus be a riot in vaudeville? This question was meant only as a joke. Unusual animal acts were a common staple of vaudeville, but it started McCay thinking about the untapped possibilities in animation. By spring of 1912, McCay was contemplating ways that animation might expand beyond simple motion. He wanted to make a cartoon that would have greater depth than the two experimental amusements he'd created already, finding a subject that an audience could see as real. That is, he hoped to create a film that was more than a set of crude moving lines, something that would offer an audience the experience of seeing a moving drawing filled with desire and personality up there on the screen. On April 12, 1912, he told the Rochester Post, "I myself have already been approached by the American Historical Society to draw pictures of prehistoric animals, the present evidences of which are limited to their skeletons, which would represent some connected incident in their life." That is, he believed that animation might allow an audience to engage a believable experience with an extinct animal. That same month, for the motion picture journal Motography, he explained that audiences would soon be bored by stories told with still illustrations. They would look to animation for more engaging material. "What interests me most," he said, "however, is the possibility of serious educational work with this method of producing moving pictures. I have already had a conference with the American Historical Society looking to the presentation of pictures showing the great monsters that used to inhabit this earth. There are skeletons of them on exhibition, and I expect to draw pictures of these animals as they appeared in real life thousands of years ago. There is almost no end to what an artist might do with such an idea." In the months that followed, he likely considered the enormous work that would be required to complete this project. On July 19th, he asked John Fitzsimmons to see his vaudeville presentation in Buffalo, New York, possibly as he was already thinking of hiring him to be his part-time assistant. There, on stage, McCay introduced himself as the cartoonist, then showed his first two animated films, Little Nemo and How a Mosquito Operates. Shortly after that, Fitzsimmons found himself working on the dinosaur picture as McCay's assistant. "The first film I worked on," Fitzsimmons said, "was Gertie the Dinosaur. McCay liked to do the action work, and the backgrounds weren't very elaborate." As the film was designed as a single, continuous scene, McCay made a master background that would be used throughout the film, though it would need to be altered as Gertie moved boulders and ate a tree. Fitzsimmons' work as an assistant was straightforward. He would trace this background drawing, the rocks, cave, and tree, on each sheet of rice paper after McCay finished the drawing of Gertie. The rice paper was thin, nearly translucent. On its edge, the paper had registration lines arranged as a cross so that McCay, as an animator, would be able to perfectly line up each sheet, one on top of the other, so the image wouldn't wobble from one drawing to the next. The paper was so thin that after the art was finished, each sheet needed to be mounted to cardboard so that it was firm and flat enough to be photographed. Fitzsimmons worked on Gertie for several months. Over and over he drew those same rocks, that same tree, the same set of leaves, hundreds and hundreds of times. On some nights, the two of them worked side by side at McCay's house, and on some nights Fitzsimmons took McCay's drawings home and finished the backgrounds there. McCay funded the entire film on his own, paying Fitzsimmons out of his own pocket, believing that he'd make a profit off it later on the vaudeville circuit. "It was the first money I ever made for drawings," Fitzsimmons later said. Through this experience, Fitzsimmons had a front row seat to observe how a newspaper artist was inventing the field and practice of American animation. He would sometimes sit up all night and do a batch of drawings, Fitzsimmons recalled. Then he'd give them to me to put in the backgrounds and things. And then maybe he wouldn't be able to get at it again for another week, and he'd be off on a vaudeville tour or something. He never worked steady on these things. McCay produced one drawing for each frame of film, trying to match the fluidity of his animation to the fluidity of live action. Fitzsimmons also understood that though Gertie was designed as a realistic dinosaur, her movements were largely based on the performance of trained elephants that McCay had observed in his early years when he'd drawn promotional posters for a traveling circus. He knew all about the animals, Fitzsimmons said, indicating McCay assumed that prehistoric animals would behave roughly like their modern-day descendants. After each sequence of action had been produced, it had then to be checked for smoothness of action, Fitzsimmons explained. McCay managed this chore very neatly. By building a box-like contraption, he ran a shaft between the sides. On it, he placed a large spool-like hub that held the sequence of drawings. This wooden contraption worked more or less like a giant flipbook, in which the rice paper drawings, mounted to thin sheets of cardboard, flipped around a hub, flashing one top image at a time like an enormous mutoscope. He got the idea from the penny arcade business, Fitzsimmons explained. With this, McCay could not only check the consistency of size between each image, but also the line of action and the timing of the movement. He could get a good idea of the speed of the thing, whether it was too fast or too slow. He could tell whether he needed to splice in some drawings in between. In short, this invention allowed McCay to test animation before it was filmed. Beyond this, McCay had already learned that movement in animation, or the motion gap between the drawings, was a far more complex skill to master than simple drawing. A person must be able to figure the movements of an object down to a small fraction of a second, McCay explained, and draw a series of outlines so that when thrown on the screen, the action will be properly timed. When Gertie was lying on her side, I wanted her to breathe, and I tried my watch and also a stopwatch to judge how long she was inhaling and how long it took her to exhale. I could come to no exact time until one day I happened to be working where a large clock with a big second-hand dial accurately marked the intervals of time. I stood in front of this clock and inhaled and exhaled and found that, imitating the great dinosaur panting as you would expect, she was breathing very easily. During these months, Fitzsimmons observed some of McCay's tricks for managing the enormous workload of creating an animated cartoon. At times, McCay created cycles of animation, a series of motion that could be repeated on screen, such as when Gertie repeatedly rocked her feet or when she lay on her side and breathed. I only drew her breathing once, McCay said, but I photographed that set of drawings over 15 times. These drawings were configured into a loop, a repeated cycle in which Gertie breathed for many seconds, even though McCay had only drawn the set of breathing drawings once. Beyond this, McCay explained how reversed drawings were used to create a different type of animation loop. For example, when Gertie bowed, McCay drew a set of drawings to show Gertie lowering her head. The movement of Gertie raising her head were the exact same set of drawings, simply shot in reverse order. Lastly, he explained the system that he used to time out action in his animation, a technique that would later be called the split system. For example, when McCay was figuring out how to create the action of Gertie throwing a boulder at a mastodon swimming in the lake, he didn't simply animate straight forward, creating one drawing and then the next. Instead, he laid out a path of action, deciding first how long it would take the boulder to move through the air at a specific rate of speed and hit its target. In the film, the boulder is in the air for roughly 2 seconds, or roughly 32 frames shot at 16 frames per second. To start the process, McCay would draw the first and last drawings in the sequence, the boulder leaving Gertie's mouth and the boulder splashing into the water. Then, at the midway point, drawing 16, McCay would draw what he called the split image, the boulder midway between Gertie's mouth and its landing position. Then he would divide that length in half again. At drawing points 8 and 24, he would draw the boulder in flight halfway between Gertie's mouth and the midpoint of flight, and then halfway between the midpoint of flight and its landing position. In this way, using a mathematical system, he timed out and broke down action so that objects moved smoothly and at the speed he desired. This system also managed the arc of motion, as McCay could decide on the distance the boulder would fly, the speed it would move, and the height it would achieve, long before animating out the entire scene. At times, McCay claimed it took 10,000 drawings to create the film. Other times, he said 20,000. Both of these figures were likely an exaggeration, offered with a showman's flourish to oversell his efforts to the public. Regardless, the film required thousands of unique drawings, making it one of the most complex pieces of animation produced at the time of its release. The presentation of Gertie, like some other films in 1914, was initially part of a vaudeville program. A program might also include comedians, magicians, dramatic actors presenting a playlet, musicians and singers, lecturers, and other performers. For example, in Brooklyn, McCay's act was placed on a program with a comedian from London, a Native American singer, a pair of dancers, and a trained fox terrier who performed with acrobats. McCay's film was often billed as a presentation of moving picture images or moving comics, but the stated goal of Gertie was to challenge the audience's idea of what was real and to explore the types of illusions that sequential drawings might produce in film. It's difficult now to pinpoint when McCay premiered the Gertie film, as most of his performances present him in the papers as Winsor McCay cartoonist, without referencing the specific film in his act that night. But it likely occurred the week of January 25, 1914, at Hammerstein's Theater in New York, where his act was listed simply as Winsor McCay and his moving picture sketches. The theater was located only 2 miles from the museum that held the impressive skeleton that had inspired the cartoon. In the performance, McCay, appearing on stage in a tuxedo, adopted the demeanor of an animal trainer, a familiar role within any vaudeville theater. But then he began to subvert the audience's expectations. Instead of introducing a trained dog or horse, McCay told the audience that he would speak to Gertie the dinosaur and that she would do anything he asked. He asked Gertie to come out of the cave, to take a pretty bow, and to roll over and play dead. Like many performing animals, Gertie at times refused to pay attention to her trainer and even cried when she was scolded. One of the high points of the act occurred when McCay asked the live orchestra to play a number, and then asked Gertie up on the screen to waltz on her back legs. One viewer noted that McCay even snapped a whip after the fashion of an animal trainer to get Gertie's attention. These actions, of course, were scripted out long ago, before McCay had even made the first drawing, and now the performance required McCay to act as though he were engaged with a real creature up there on the screen. The performance concluded when McCay, likely standing behind the screen, announced that he'd proved Gertie was not afraid of people, only to have his own image appear on screen beside the animal, after which the dinosaur lifted him onto her back. Then the two of them left the screen together. The audience, having likely only seen cartoon characters in moving comics or experimental animation, were often overwhelmed by this film, not always understanding how the illusion had been created. In these first performances, McCay explained, the audience said Gertie was a papier-mâché animal with men inside of it and a scenic background, but as the production progressed, they noticed that the leaves in the trees were blowing in the breeze and that there were rippling waves on the surface of the water, and when the elephant was thrown into the lake, the water was seen to splash. This convinced them that they were seeing something new, that the presentation was actually from a set of drawings. The animation was incredibly smooth and well-timed, especially for a film produced in 1914. Equally impressive, the background, as complex as it was, remained fixed and true, frame after frame, with only the smallest variation between drawings, a small wiggle of line weight or a subtle shift in the shape of a rock. One early reviewer writing in March for Variety called it about the best thing in a comedy film ever put on. For most of 1914, McCay performed his act with Gertie in major American cities, New York, Chicago, Allentown, and so forth, though his employer, John Randolph Hearst, forced him to cancel at least one set of performances in Pittsburgh, as he felt McCay's vaudeville efforts were taking too much time away from his work at the newspaper. At the end of the year, McCay created a second version of Gertie arranged into a standalone film that could be shown at 5-cent movie houses throughout the country, early cinemas that were often called Nickelodeons. This standalone film included a lengthy live-action prologue in which McCay visited the Natural History Museum with George McManus and a few other artist friends to view the recently unearthed skeletons of dinosaurs. In this scene, McCay makes a wager that he can bring one of these ancient beasts back to life through drawings. The film culminates with McCay showing the animation of Gertie to his friends over dinner, a slightly shortened version of the one that was used in his vaudeville act, and then to have his friends marvel at how the dinosaur followed all, or most all, of his commands. McCay's film particularly, and how Gertie wasn't just a moving drawing, but a drawing that radiated personality, deeply influenced the first wave of artists who would later work for commercial studios. Walt Disney's partner, Iwerks, who saw the non-vaudeville version of the film, would later claim that Gertie changed his life forever. Bill Teitla, perhaps the most significant animator of the first half of the 20th century, saw the vaudeville act in New York with his uncle. His wife would later explain, the sheer wonder of it all had Bill totally mesmerized. He never forgot it. Carl Thalberg, an early animator both at Disney's and Warner Brothers, said that most early animated films were little more than glorified chalk talks. It remained for Gertie the dinosaur to start the ball rolling in the direction of present-day animated cartoon technique. Walt Disney himself was so impressed with the film that in 1955, long after Winsor McCay's death, he set about to recreate McCay's vaudeville performance to include in a television documentary about the origins of American animation. As a boy, Walt had only seen the standalone film, never the full vaudeville performance, so to recreate it, Walt asked those artists at his studio from New York to describe in detail how the performance had been arranged on stage. One longtime Disney artist, Dick Humor, explained that for this production, they relied on his memories of seeing the vaudeville performance decades ago in New York. Beyond this, the Disney team faced the problem of finding a print of this long-forgotten early masterwork. Wilfred Jackson recalled that eventually, Winsor McCay's son Bob loaned us the film. After Disney made contact, Bob also came to the studio to help finalize details of his father's old show. In the end, the Disney team recreated McCay's old performance, preserving it in the new medium of television. The episode dramatized the development of American animation from early experiments up through mid-century features. It was one of the few documentaries that Walt himself narrated from start to finish. The McCay segment, a focus of the early portion of the film, received twice as much screen time as that devoted to any other animation pioneer, revealing that McCay's efforts were, in Disney's estimation, central to establishing American animation as an art form. Ultimately, McCay never pursued a full-time career in animation. His publisher, Hearst, made him choose between his vaudeville shows and his work for the newspaper. Beyond this, McCay, with his eye for detail and innovation, might not have fared well overseeing his own studio. For McCay, his short films were a labor of love, far more than they were a commercial product. McCay, Fitzsimmons said, essentially was an artist who derived considerable pleasure watching his ideas and the creatures of his fancy come to life on his drawing board. Another time he said, "I don't think McCay would ever set into an office and have a dozen people drawing that stuff under him." That is, in Fitzsimmons' estimation, McCay wanted to be an artist, the one at the drawing board and not a supervisor overseeing the work of others and directing a film. McCay would continue for years to work on his own short animated films. One of his films, The Sinking of the Lusitania, in terms of visual development, would create a high point of artistic expression for early American animation, a film on which Fitzsimmons also worked as his assistant. Likewise, Fitzsimmons didn't pursue a career in animation either. Perhaps, through McCay's example, he saw the difficulties of producing sophisticated moving art, believing that it was and always would be tedious work. Or perhaps he too was mostly interested in still art. Regardless, while The Sinking of the Lusitania was still in production, he moved to Philadelphia to work for an art service. A few years later, he returned to New York to work in the advertising industry. During this time, Fitzsimmons renewed his friendship with McCay. "I used to visit McCay regularly," he said. But Fitzsimmons was no longer his assistant. He had his own job now. In 1923, Fitzsimmons' father, Sonny Jim, became the trainer for one of the leading stables in the United States, Bel Air Stud and Stable. Under his watch, the stable produced some of the most famous horses in the world, including Gallant Fox and Omaha, the only father and son pair of horses to win the U.S. Triple Crown. Eventually, John Fitzsimmons decided to work alongside his father, under that wide and prosperous umbrella of his family's success. In the end, Fitzsimmons' story was one of being surrounded by men far more famous than himself, more than it was about following his own ambitions. Late in life, he would reflect on the many delightful and rewarding hours spent in the company of Winsor McCay, an artist whose reputation still stretched around the world. In these reflections, he seemed satisfied with his own life, the way that he had touched greatness, never fully grasping that in his youth he too had contributed to the starting point of an American industry, picking up skills and techniques from a master, skills that might have led him away from horses and advertising, perhaps making him too an early pioneer of an industry that would soon find ways to make the work of animation less tedious, if only he had decided to follow that path. I'll be back on Sunday with a new episode, but also, if you're interested in the story of how animation invents itself in America, on Bandcamp we have a multi-part series on the life of animator and director Dick Huemer. One of the amazing things about Dick Huemer's life is that he worked at many of the early animation studios before finding his way to Disney's in California. It's listed as an album on Bandcamp with 5 parts, and all the story runs about 2 hours and 40 minutes and explores the evolution of early animation with an eye toward how Walt Disney contributed and then redefined the art form. The album is called Dick Huemer and the Early Days of American Animation. If you're looking for the album on the Bandcamp mobile app, scroll down a ways. You'll need to go through many episodes until you see a cover photo of a man in a club chair. The photo is sepia-toned black and white. It's easy to spot because most of our cover photos on the Bandcamp app are in color. And lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes, including many multi-part series arranged into albums. But the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.